It had a 4.9-star rating, hundreds of glowing reviews from guests who praised the isolation and the privacy. The host promised me a perfect, quiet weekend in the deep woods, and he delivered, because he wanted me completely isolated for what he had planned. The listing had a 4.98-star rating out of 142 reviews. An absolute sanctuary, a woman named Brenda had written 3 weeks prior. If you need to disconnect from the world and find peace, David's cabin is the perfect escape. He is the ultimate superhost, anticipates every need without ever intruding. We never even saw him, but we felt completely taken care of. That was exactly what I was looking for. After a brutal 6-month stretch at a corporate firm that had left my nerves frayed to the point of snapping, I didn't just want a vacation. I wanted isolation. I wanted a place where my phone wouldn't ring, where the nearest neighbor was a mile away, and where the silence was heavy enough to drown out the constant, buzzing anxiety in my head. The A-frame cabin was located deep in the dense evergreen throat of the Pacific Northwest, at the end of a private, unpaved logging road that GPS struggled to even recognize. The drive took 3 hours from the city, the last 45 minutes consisting entirely of navigating deep, muddy ruts flanked by towering pines that seemed to lean inward, swallowing the gray afternoon light. By the time I pulled up to the property, a thick, bruised twilight had settled over the woods. The cabin was stunning. It was a severe geometric structure of black timber and massive floor-to-ceiling glass panes that reflected the surrounding forest. It looked less like a home and more like an observation blind. I grabbed my duffel bag and groceries from the trunk, the crunch of my boots on the gravel sounding obnoxiously loud in the oppressive quiet of the woods. The check-in instructions on the Airbnb app were simple. The code for the lockbox on the front porch is 8214. The physical key is inside. Make yourself at home. I punched the numbers in. The small metal door popped open, offering up a heavy brass key. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, stepping into the immaculate cedar-scented air of my weekend sanctuary. The interior was straight out of an architectural magazine. Polished concrete floors, a floating iron staircase leading to a lofted reading nook, a massive stone fireplace, and an open-concept kitchen with matte black appliances. I locked the deadbolt behind me, the heavy thwack of the metal echoing through the empty house. I was entirely, wonderfully alone. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message through the Airbnb app. David, superhost. Looks like you made it. The smart lock notified me the door was opened. I hope the drive wasn't too rough. The weather forecast says we're expecting a heavy rainstorm over the next 2 days, so you picked the perfect time to stay inside and build a fire. Let me know if you need absolutely anything. Enjoy the total privacy. I smiled, typing back a quick thank you. I liked David's style, attentive but strictly digital. I took a tour of the ground floor to get my bearings. The living room flowed into a short, narrow hallway. On the left was the master bedroom, a beautiful, minimalist room with a low-profile king-sized bed and another massive window looking out into the pitch-black tree line. On the right was the master bathroom, outfitted with slate tiles and a massive walk-in glass shower. At the very end of the hallway, dead center, was a heavy oak door. Unlike the rest of the modern handleless doors in the cabin, this one had a bulky industrial-grade keypad deadbolt installed above the doorknob. A small brushed brass plaque was screwed into the wood at eye level. Owner's supply closet, do not enter. It made sense. Hosts needed a place to store extra linens, cleaning chemicals, and bulk supplies. I reached out and gave the handle a gentle twist, just out of instinct. It didn't budge, solid as a bank vault. I dismissed it entirely, walking back to the kitchen to unpack my groceries, pour myself a glass of bourbon, and finally let my shoulders drop. The first night was uneventful, save for the profound, suffocating darkness that pressed against the massive windows. When you are used to the ambient light of a city, the true darkness of the deep woods feels almost aggressive. Without curtains on the main living room windows, I felt exposed, as if I were sitting in a lit aquarium. I eventually retreated to the master bedroom, pulling the heavy blackout shades down, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted. The first tiny fracture in my reality occurred the next morning. I woke up around 9 a.m. The promised storm had arrived, lashing the roof with heavy, rhythmic sheets of rain. I stretched, enjoying the warmth of the duvet, before swinging my legs out of bed and walking across the hall to the bathroom to take a shower. I pushed the heavy glass door of the walk-in shower open and stepped inside barefoot. My foot splashed into a shallow puddle of water. I froze, looking down at the slate tiles. The shower floor wasn't just damp, it was visibly wet. Small beads of water clung to the grout lines near the drain, and the bottom foot of the glass enclosure was fogged with faint condensation. I frowned, a cold prickle of confusion crawling up my spine. I hadn't taken a shower the night before. I had just brushed my teeth and gone straight to bed. I crouched down, touching the wet tile. It was cold, meaning the water hadn't been run recently, perhaps hours ago. I brought my fingers to my nose. There was a faint, distinct smell. It wasn't the citrus-scented body wash provided in the little complimentary bottles on the vanity. It smelled metallic, earthy, like old copper and damp soil. My brain instantly went into overdrive, desperately trying to build a logical bridge over this terrifying gap in reality. Condensation, I told myself. The house is a sealed envelope of glass and concrete. The storm outside caused a massive temperature drop. The pipes probably hold moisture, or maybe a slow drip from the shower head pooled overnight. I looked up at the matte black shower head. It was bone dry. I forced a laugh, the sound harsh and unnatural in the small tiled room. I was doing exactly what burned out, anxious people do, inventing threats out of thin air. Brenda's review echoed in my head. A perfect escape. He anticipates every need. I turned the hot water on, washing away the cold puddle and the strange, earthy smell, letting the steam melt the tension out of my neck. I spent the rest of day 2 trying to force myself to relax. I read a book. I watched the rain hammer the A-frame windows. I ate a late lunch, a massive bowl of pasta I cooked on the induction stove, and packed the leftovers into a plastic Tupperware container, shoving it lazily onto the bottom shelf of the refrigerator behind a carton of milk. But as the afternoon bled into a murky gray evening, the atmosphere of the cabin began to change. The silence, which had felt so therapeutic yesterday, now felt heavy, stagnant. I found myself pausing my music, standing dead still in the center of the kitchen, just listening. Listening for what? The wind, the settling of the timber, or the faint, almost imperceptible sound of weight shifting on the floorboard somewhere else in the house. I checked the front door deadbolt 3 times before the sun went down. It was locked. The physical key was sitting right on the kitchen island where I had left it. I checked the back patio slider. Locked. No one had come in. No one could come in. I went to bed early, taking a mild over-the-counter sleep aid to force my hyperactive brain to shut down. Day 3 is when the psychological trap snapped shut. I woke up groggy, the sleep aid leaving a fuzzy film over my thoughts. The rain was still pounding the roof, the storm having escalated into a relentless deluge. I walked into the kitchen to make coffee. As the machine sputtered and hissed, I opened the refrigerator to grab the milk. I stopped. My hand hovered in the chilled air. The Tupperware container holding my leftover pasta was no longer on the bottom shelf behind the milk. It was sitting dead center on the middle shelf. My heart gave a hard, painful thud against my ribs. I stared at the plastic container. I remembered, with crystal clarity, bending down and shoving it onto the bottom shelf because I'd been too lazy to rearrange the taller bottles on the middle shelf. "You moved it!" my rational brain screamed. "You moved it when you got a glass of water last night. You were half asleep on medication. You don't remember." I grabbed the Tupperware. It felt lighter. I popped the lid off. The pasta was disturbed. A clean, perfect fork-sized chunk had been scooped out of the center. I spun around, my eyes sweeping the kitchen, the sink. Sitting in the bottom of the pristine stainless steel basin was a single dirty fork. The tines were coated in dried tomato sauce. A wave of pure, paralyzing nausea washed over me. I back away from the sink, my breathing turning shallow and rapid. I didn't eat that pasta. I'm a meticulous cleaner. I never leave dishes in the sink. The fork was there. The shower was wet. I wasn't alone. I pulled my phone out with trembling hands and opened the Airbnb app. I clicked on David's profile, my thumbs fumbling over the glass screen. "David, this is going to sound crazy, but has anyone else been inside the cabin? A maintenance worker? A cleaner who forgot something?" I stared at the 3 gray dots pulsing on the screen. He was typing. David replied, "Hi there. Absolutely not. As I promised, you have 100% exclusive access to the property. The only person with the code is you. Is everything all right? Do you need me to come up there?" I stared at the message. The only person with the code is you. If I said yes, if I asked him to come up, I would sound insane. I would be the paranoid city guy hallucinating intruders because he forgot he ate pasta at 2 a.m. on sleeping pills. And more importantly, the muddy logging road was currently impassable in my low-clearance sedan due to the storm. If I tried to leave now, I would get stuck in the mud miles from the highway. I was physically trapped until the rain stopped. I typed, "No, everything's fine. Just misplaced something, thanks." I spent the rest of day 3 in a state of hyper-vigilant terror. I didn't read. I didn't listen to music. I sat in the reading nook overlooking the ground floor, watching the front door, watching the hallway, watching the locked oak door of the owner's supply closet. Every creak of the house settling sounded like a footstep. Every shadow cast by the swaying pines looked like a figure standing just outside the glass. But nobody came through the doors. The house remained perfectly, impossibly still. By 11 p.m., exhaustion finally began to override my adrenaline. I couldn't sit up guarding the stairs forever. The doors were locked. The windows were unbroken. The threat was in my head. It had to be. I retreated to the master bedroom. I locked the bedroom door behind me, a flimsy interior lock, but it offered a microdose of comfort. I turned off the overhead light, plunging the room into darkness, save for the weak bluish glow of my phone screen. I lay in the center of the king-sized bed, pulling the duvet up to my chin. The rain drummed heavily against the exterior wall. It was a comforting, isolating sound. I scrolled mindlessly through articles I wasn't reading, trying to force my eyes to blur. My grip relaxed for a fraction of a second. The heavy smartphone slipped from my fingers. It hit the edge of the mattress, tumbled over the side, and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. It didn't just land, it skittered, sliding deep underneath the low-profile bed frame. "Damn it," I whispered, my voice sounding raspy and loud in the dark room. I rolled over, hanging my head and shoulders off the edge of the mattress. The space beneath the bed was pitch black. I reached my arm under, sweeping my hand in a blind arc across the smooth hardwood. Nothing. It had slid all the way to the center. I let out a frustrated sigh, reaching over to the nightstand to grab the small LED flashlight I always traveled with. I clicked it on, the harsh white beam cutting through the darkness of the bedroom. I leaned over the edge of the bed again, lowering my head so my cheek was practically pressed against the floorboards, and shined the flashlight underneath the frame. The hardwood floor beneath the bed was immaculately clean. No dust bunnies, no lost socks. And right in the dead center, directly beneath where my torso had been resting for the last 3 nights, was a massive rectangular iron floor vent. I frowned, keeping the beam fixed on it. It was industrial, thick iron slats, but there was no hum of HVAC machinery, no warm air blowing upward. In fact, the air drafting up from it was freezing cold, carrying that exact same metallic, earthy scent I had smelled in the shower. I shimmied my shoulders a little further under the bed to get a closer look. The flashlight beam cut through the iron slats and illuminated the space below. It wasn't a shallow duct. It was a deep, hollow drop down into a dark, unlit crawl space that ran the length of the foundation. The geometry of the house snapped into focus in my mind with terrifying, violent clarity. The bedroom shared a wall with the hallway. The hallway ended at the locked owner's supply closet. The closet wasn't a closet. It was the access door to the crawl space. My hand began to shake uncontrollably, the beam of the flashlight vibrating across the iron slats. Down in the dark, something shifted. The light caught a pale, dirt-smudged hand resting on the concrete foundation wall below. Then, the beam illuminated a sliver of a face pressed right up against the underside of the floorboards, looking directly up at me through the iron vent. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely sane. A slow, terrible smile stretched across the cracked lips in the darkness. And then, cutting through the white noise of the storm, I heard the wet, ragged sound of an exhale from just inches below my face. "I'm so glad you decided to stay another night," a man's voice whispered through the slats, the sound vibrating directly into the floorboards. In the hallway just outside my flimsy bedroom door, the heavy mechanical keypad on the owner's supply closet beeped once, followed by the metallic clack of the deadbolt disengaging from the inside. I used to think cabins with floor-to-ceiling windows were beautiful, until I realized the glass wasn't installed so we could look out at the woods. It was designed for something else entirely. When my boyfriend Mark and I booked the cabin in the Blackwood Valley, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows were the main selling point. The listing photos showed a gorgeous, modern architectural marvel nestled in a dense grove of ancient Douglas firs, bathed in the soft, golden-hour sunlight of the Pacific Northwest. The caption had read, "Immerse yourself in nature. Total transparency. Total peace. We desperately needed it." The last year had been a meat grinder for both of us. We were both working 60-hour weeks at competing firms in the city, surrounded by endless concrete, sirens, and the suffocating pressure of deadlines. It was taking a toll. We were snapping at each other over unwashed dishes and forgotten groceries. The distance between us was slowly widening, and we were trying to bridge it with a long weekend of forced, quiet isolation. The drive up had done exactly what it was supposed to do, physically distance us from the world. The property was located 14 miles off the main highway, down a serpentine logging road that degraded from cracked asphalt to loose gravel, and finally to deeply rutted, washed-out dirt. The towering pines pressed in on both sides, their heavy branches interlocking over the road to block out the gray afternoon sky. By the time we crossed the rusted iron cattle guard that marked the property line, the sun had fully dipped below the tree line. The shadows stretching across the hood of our Subaru were long and skeletal. To make matters worse, about 2 miles from the cabin, we hit a sharp, jagged piece of buried slate that instantly shredded the front right tire. The steering wheel jerked violently in Mark's hands, and the awful grinding noise of the rim chewing into the dirt shattered the quiet of the woods. We limped the car the rest of the way at 5 miles an hour, the chassis vibrating violently. "Well," Mark said, cutting the engine and staring out through the windshield at the darkening woods, "we aren't going anywhere until the tow truck gets here tomorrow afternoon, assuming they can even get a flatbed up that mud path. Good thing we brought enough wine." I offered a weak laugh, trying to brush off the sudden sharp spike of anxiety tightening my chest. We were completely alone. My phone in the cup holder showed no service in the top left corner. We had a dead car, no neighbors for miles, and only the groceries in the trunk. The cabin itself was stunning, exactly as advertised. It was a severe, beautiful structure of black timber and massive panes of glass. But as night completely fell and we turned on the interior lights, the modern architecture immediately began to work against us. When you are inside a brightly lit room made almost entirely of glass, and it is pitch black outside, you cannot see out. The glass turns into a perfect, impenetrable mirror. Everywhere I looked, I only saw the reflection of the modern living room, the kitchen island, and my own pale, tired face. But anyone standing outside in the dark could see in with absolute high-definition clarity. We were living in a lit terrarium. "Don't they have blinds?" I asked, pacing the length of the living room with a heavy pour of Cabernet in my glass. My sock slid softly against the polished concrete floor. Mark was already sprawled on the leather sofa. He was scrolling blindly through the offline photos on his phone out of sheer habit. "The listing said there are no blinds on the ground floor. It's a design choice to preserve the unbroken connection with the environment or something like that. But it also said there's 100 acres of private gated land around us. Who's going to look in? A raccoon?" He was referencing a detail from the Airbnb description that had actually made me feel a little better when we booked it weeks ago. "Please note, for the safety of the property and for wildlife monitoring, there are 4 motion-activated trail cameras mounted in the woods around the perimeter of the cabin. They do not face the interior." It had seemed like a responsible, normal thing for a rural property owner to do. A tech-savvy host wanting to keep an eye on his expensive investment and maybe catch some cool footage of a black bear or a passing elk. We ate a simple dinner of pasta and marinara sauce, drank the rest of the wine, and tried to ignore the oppressive wall of blackness pressing against the glass on all 4 sides. We talked, but the conversation felt strained, swallowed by the sheer volume of the empty space around us. By 10:30 p.m., the exhaustion of the long drive and the stress of the blown tire hit Mark. He rubbed his eyes, kissed my forehead, mumbled something about waking up early to check the spare tire kit in the trunk, and walked down the short hallway to the master bedroom. He shut the door softly behind him. I stayed up. My brain was still vibrating with the residual hum of the city, and the absolute silence of the woods was deafening. There was no wind, no crickets, no hum of distant traffic, just a heavy, dead quiet that made the inside of my ears ring. By midnight, the small fire we had built in the wood stove had died down to glowing orange embers. The ambient temperature in the cabin plummeted, the cold radiating off the massive panes of glass. I checked the digital thermostat on the wall, but it was locked behind a clear plastic host box set rigidly to 62 degrees. Shivering in my oversized sweater, I decided to hunt for a spare blanket. I checked the hall closet first. It held only a cordless vacuum, a broom, and a few spare light bulbs. I checked the woven decorative baskets under the coffee table. Empty. In the far corner of the living room, facing the massive wall of glass, was a heavy antique oak desk. It felt completely out of place among the modern minimalist furniture, a relic left over from whatever old hunting shack used to sit on this property. I walked over and pulled the brass handle of the top drawer. Locked? I jiggled it. Solid. I checked the left and right drawers, both locked. Normally, I would have walked away. You don't snoop through a host's private storage. But my teeth were practically chattering. I was annoyed by the locked thermostat, and the sheer isolation of the cabin was making me feel a bit reckless. I knelt down on the concrete floor, running my fingers underneath the lip of the desk, feeling for a hidden latch. My fingers brushed against a small, rough plastic square. A magnetic hide-a-key box stuck to the underside of the wood. I pulled it free, popped the sliding lid open, and extracted a small, dull brass key. I slid the key into the top drawer and turned it. With a heavy, satisfying thunk, the old locking mechanism disengaged. I pulled the wooden drawer open, expecting to find a folded wool blanket, some spare D-cell batteries, or maybe a first aid kit. The drawer was entirely empty, except for a sleek, heavy-duty black tablet resting flat on the green felt lining. A thick, braided power cable ran from the bottom of the tablet, passed through a hole drilled into the back of the drawer, and plugged directly into a wall outlet behind the desk. It wasn't a standard consumer iPad. It looked industrial, encased in a rugged, shockproof rubber shell, the kind used on construction sites. I hesitated. I looked over my shoulder at the closed bedroom door, then out at my own reflection in the black glass. I reached down and pressed the power button on the side of the device. The screen flared to life instantly, casting a harsh, bluish-white glow across my face and torso. I squinted, adjusting to the sudden brightness. The screen didn't ask for a passcode. It didn't have a home screen with apps or a web browser. It booted directly into a proprietary software application called Vigilant Cam Pro. The trail cameras, I thought, the wildlife monitors. I remembered the host's listing again. 4 motion-activated cameras in the woods. I expected to see a time-lapse of a deer eating brush, or maybe a coyote trotting past the tree line. It might actually be nice to see the woods, to prove to myself that there was nothing out there in the dark. The app loaded, displaying a grid of 4 black squares on the high-definition screen. In the center, a small white loading wheel spun, connecting to local network. The cabin was dead silent. I could hear the faint rhythmic sound of Mark snoring from the bedroom down the hall. The screen blinked once. The 4 squares simultaneously populated with live video feeds. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the grid, my mind desperately trying to rationalize the geometry of the images, trying to force them to be something they were not. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes darting from square to square. I wasn't looking at the woods. None of the cameras were facing outward. Every single one was mounted deep in the trees, pointed directly back at the cabin. I tapped the square labeled Camera 1 to expand it to full screen. It was a crisp, high-definition night vision feed. The camera was positioned high up in the branches of a thick pine tree, maybe 30 yards from the house. It was zoomed in, tightly. It was pointed directly at the master bedroom window. Because the interior lights were off in the bedroom, the glass didn't act as a mirror. The camera saw right through it. The feed was bathed in an eerie green tint. I could see the shape of the bed. I could see the dark lump of the duvet. I could see Mark sleeping on his side, his arm dangling off the edge of the mattress. The angle was deliberate. It wasn't a wide shot of the property that happened to catch the window. The lens had been manually focused and framed to center the bed perfectly. My hand began to shake. A cold, prickling sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I tapped the screen to minimize it, my finger slipping twice on the smooth glass because my hands were trembling so badly. I opened camera 2. This one was mounted lower, maybe 10 feet off the ground, hidden somewhere in the thick rhododendron bushes on the east side of the cabin. It was pointed at the master bathroom. The bathroom window was made of textured, frosted privacy glass. You couldn't see through it from the outside, but the camera wasn't pointing at the center of the window. It was pointed at the small, clear 2-inch gap at the very top where the awning window cranked open to let out steam. The camera was angled perfectly to shoot down through that gap, providing an unobstructed, high-definition view straight into the glass shower enclosure. I stared at the empty shower on the screen, feeling a profound, nauseating wave of violation wash over me. The host had sold us on transparency, on the beauty of nature, knowing we would walk around this glass box feeling totally alone, while he had positioned lenses to capture every intimate, private moment we had in the house. I swallowed hard. My mouth tasted like old copper. I backed out of the second feed. I didn't want to click the third one. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to drop the tablet, to run down the hall, wake Mark up, lock the bedroom door, and hide in the windowless closet until the sun came up. But I couldn't look away. I had to know exactly how exposed we were. I tapped camera 3. The feed expanded. The camera was mounted on a thick wooden post about 40 feet from the front of the cabin. It was a wide shot of the main living room. I was looking at myself. Through the grainy green filter of the night vision, I saw the massive wall of glass. I saw the leather couch. I saw the unlit wood stove. And I saw myself, a tiny glowing figure in an oversized sweater, sitting at the antique desk, hunched over the glowing tablet. I stared at my own back on the screen. It was a live feed. When I slowly raised my trembling left hand to my mouth, the tiny green figure on the screen mirrored the movement exactly a half-second later. I scanned the green perimeter of the woods in camera 3's feed, looking for the glow of a cigarette, the shape of a person standing behind the post, a shadow moving in the brush. But the woods were entirely still. The wind wasn't even blowing. I backed out of camera 3 and looked at the final square. Camera 4. I tapped it. The feed expanded. It was a camera mounted on the edge of the roof, pointing down at the gravel driveway and the front porch. I saw the dark shape of our Subaru, leaning heavily to the right on its shredded tire. The porch was empty. The driveway was empty. There was no one standing in the dark. There was no physical threat looming outside the door. I let out a long, ragged exhale, the tension bleeding out of my shoulders. We were alone. The host was just a sick, twisted voyeur who had set up hidden cameras. He was probably hundreds of miles away in a city apartment, reviewing recorded footage. We just had to wait out the night, get the tow truck in the morning, and go straight to the police. But as I stared at the empty driveway on camera 4, my eyes drifted to the top right corner of the tablet screen. There was a small, transparent menu bar overlaid on the video feed. It displayed the Wi-Fi signal strength, the battery life of the cameras, and a small icon shaped like a person. Next to the icon was a number: active viewers, 2. My heart completely stopped. The silence in the cabin suddenly felt infinitely heavier. I tapped the icon. A small drop-down menu appeared over the empty driveway. User 1, local_hub, connected. User 2, admin_David, connected. Beneath the admin name was a digital timer. Session duration, 4 hours, 12 minutes, 33 seconds. He had been logged in and watching the live feeds for over 4 hours. He had been watching since the moment we pulled into the driveway. He watched us unpack. He watched us eat. He watched Mark go to sleep. And he was watching me right now. I stared at the tablet, paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of being observed. I wasn't just on camera, I was live entertainment. Suddenly, a new line of text popped up on the tablet's notification center at the bottom of the screen. Admin_David is currently viewing. Camera 3. He was looking at the camera that was pointed directly at my back. I slowly turned my head toward the massive pane of glass to my right. I couldn't see into the dark, but I knew exactly where camera 3 was mounted on the post outside. On the tablet screen, the video feed for camera 3 minimized back into the grid. The green square showing the living room flickered. Then, the camera physically moved. I heard the faint, high-pitched mechanical whir of a servo motor from somewhere out in the dark woods. On the screen, the wide shot of the living room began to pan and zoom. The lens physically adjusted, zooming past the couch, past the wood stove, closing in tighter and tighter until the frame was filled entirely by my face, staring in wide-eyed terror through the glass. He was controlling the camera manually. A small dialog box appeared in the center of the tablet screen. Admin_David has initiated a screen recording. I couldn't breathe. The air in the cabin felt thin, useless. I dropped the tablet onto the desk and backed away, my hands raised instinctively to cover my chest. I needed to get Mark. We needed to lock the doors. We needed to hide. I took one step toward the hallway. A loud, piercing chime echoed from the smart speaker mounted on the kitchen ceiling. The automated, pleasant voice of the digital home assistant filled the dead air of the cabin. Home security system has been bypassed by administrator. I froze. Front door deadbolt has been unlocked. From across the room, the heavy metal lock on the front door gave a loud mechanical clack as it slid open. Patio door has been unlocked. The slider in the living room clicked open. Master bedroom door has been unlocked. I stood entirely still in the center of the brightly lit glass room. The doors were unlocked. The car was dead. The nearest town was 14 miles away through the freezing mud. And out in the pitch-black woods, the mechanical lens of the camera whirred again, adjusting its focus to watch what I would do next. There's no better feeling than escaping a blinding storm and finally locking the heavy door of a warm, isolated cabin behind you. You finally drop your bags, exhale, and feel entirely secure. But a locked door only works if the house is actually empty. The rain didn't just fall, it attacked the windshield. It was a torrential, blinding downpour. The kind of storm that turns the world into a gray, featureless smear. I was navigating a steep, winding switchback in the Appalachian foothills, the headlights of my Jeep doing nothing but illuminating the dense sheets of water hammering the glass. The wipers were on their highest setting, thrashing violently back and forth, but they couldn't keep up. I leaned forward, my chest practically pressed against the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The GPS on my phone had lost its signal 40 minutes ago, leaving me with only the host's hastily written screenshot directions. Take a left at the rusted mailboxes. Go exactly 3.2 miles up the gravel road. The cabin is at the dead end. You can't miss it. I found the rusted mailboxes, though they looked more like jagged teeth in the dark. I made the turn. The gravel road was quickly turning into a river of brown mud. My tires slipped and spun, the engine whining as it fought for traction. I was exhausted. I'd been driving for 8 hours, fueled by nothing but gas station coffee and the desperate need to get away from a life that had suddenly, violently fallen apart. I just needed a roof. I needed a locked door. I needed to sleep for 2 days straight. Finally, the headlights caught the shape of a structure cutting through the deluge. It was a traditional log cabin, heavy and squat, with a wraparound porch that offered the only dry refuge for miles. I pulled the Jeep up close to the wooden steps, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment in the dark, listening to the deafening roar of the rain drumming against the metal roof. I picked up my phone to check the lockbox code. As I did, the phone vibrated in my hand. I had somehow managed to catch a single weak bar of 3G signal up here on the ridge. A text message from the Airbnb host pushed through. Greg the host, 4:15 p.m. Hey, just a heads up, the storm really messed up the roads today. My cleaning crew was running way behind schedule trying to get up there. They had to rush to beat the mudslides, but they promised me they got it turned around. The cabin should be ready for you. Code is 4092. Stay dry. I checked the timestamp. It was currently 8:30 p.m. The message had been trying to send for 4 hours. I didn't care about a rushed cleaning job. I just wanted a bed. I zipped my rain jacket up to my chin, grabbed my duffel bag, and made a run for the porch. The lockbox was attached to a thick wooden pillar. I punched in 4092, my wet fingers slipping on the metal dials. The box clicked open. I grabbed the heavy brass key, shoved it into the deadbolt, and pushed my way inside. I slammed the door behind me, throwing the deadbolt and leaning my full weight against the solid wood, letting out a long, ragged exhale. The sound of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a heavy, constant drone above me. I reached out and flicked the light switch. The warm yellow glow of overhead lamps flooded the room. It was a cozy, open-concept space. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, flanked by 2 worn leather armchairs and a heavy, dark green sofa. To the left was a small kitchen with butcher block counters. It looked rustic, lived in, and perfectly isolated. But as I dropped my duffel bag by the door and shrugged off my soaked jacket, the first subtle wave of unease washed over me. It was the smell. When you enter an empty, freshly cleaned cabin, it usually smells like pine sol, stale air, or maybe wood ash. But the air in here felt heavy, humid. It smelled distinctly like wet wool and stale body odor. The cleaners, I rationalized immediately, hanging my dripping jacket on a peg by the door. They were probably sweating, rushing around trying to beat the storm. They didn't have time to air the place out. I walked into the kitchen to drop my keys on the counter. Sitting dead center on the butcher block was a white ceramic mug. I stopped, staring at it. I walked over. It wasn't an empty mug left out of the cupboard. I looked inside. It was half full of black coffee. A thick, dark ring had formed around the inside edge, showing where the liquid had slowly evaporated over a few hours. I reached out and touched the side of the ceramic. It was cold to the touch. I frowned, a knot of irritation tightening in my stomach. They promised me. They got it turned around, the host message had said. Clearly, the cleaners had just grabbed the dirty sheets, emptied the trash, and bolted down the mountain before the roads washed out, leaving their half-drank coffee right on the counter. It was unprofessional, but given the severity of the storm outside, it was entirely understandable. I tipped the cold coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and set it on the drying rack. I decided to take a hot shower to wash the 8 hours of driving off my skin. I walked through the living room and found the bathroom nestled between the 2 small bedrooms at the back of the cabin. I pushed the bathroom door open and reached for the light. The knot in my stomach tightened a fraction more. The bathroom mirror was completely fogged over, not just a little hazy. Thick, heavy condensation covered the glass, and water droplets were actively streaking down the surface. The air in the small room was suffocatingly warm and smelled strongly of cheap, generic bar soap. I looked down. Crumpled in a heap in the very corner of the linoleum floor right next to the toilet was a large, dark gray bath towel. It was soaking wet. I stood in the doorway, my mind working furiously to connect the dots. A half-drank cup of coffee, a wet towel, a steaming bathroom. The cleaners hadn't just rushed. One of them had taken a shower before leaving. A sharp spike of anger flared over my exhaustion. You pay a massive cleaning fee for an Airbnb, and the crew uses the property as their own personal locker room before abandoning it half-finished. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, fully intending to take a photo of the wet towel and send it to Greg for a partial refund. I held the phone up, but the screen was dead. The battery had finally died. "Perfect," I muttered aloud. I didn't want to deal with it tonight. The exhaustion was pulling at my bones like gravity. I grabbed the wet towel with 2 fingers, tossed it into the bathtub in disgust, and decided to skip my own shower. I just wanted to lie down. I walked back into the main living room, deciding to crash on the heavy green sofa rather than deal with whatever state the bedrooms had been left in. The rain was pounding against the living room windows, the glass vibrating slightly in the frames. The absolute darkness outside made the windows look like slabs of black obsidian. I walked over to the sofa, unlaced my heavy boots, and kicked them off. I lay down, sinking into the worn cushions, and pulled my knees to my chest. It was freezing in the cabin. The wall heater was barely putting out a weak, anemic breath of warm air. I needed a blanket. I remembered seeing a woven afghan folded underneath the coffee table. I rolled onto my stomach, hung my arm over the edge of the sofa, and reached down into the dark gap between the bottom of the couch and the floorboards, feeling blindly for the edge of the blanket. My fingers brushed against something hard, cold, metallic. It wasn't a blanket. It was a long, heavy cylinder. I frowned, my fingers tracing the smooth, oiled surface of the metal. It felt like a pipe. I gripped it and pulled it forward, dragging it out from underneath the sofa. It was heavy, much heavier than I expected. I pulled it fully into the yellow light of the living room lamps. My lungs completely stopped working. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. I was holding a pump-action 12-gauge shotgun. I stared at the weapon resting across my palms, my brain completely stalling out. The black metal of the barrel was pristine, lightly coated in gun oil. The wooden stock was scratched and worn from heavy use. This wasn't a broom. This wasn't a forgotten cleaning supply. This was a firearm, deliberately shoved under the sofa cushions for immediate, easy access. My hands began to tremble violently. The narrative I had built in my head, the sloppy, rushing cleaners, the unprofessional host, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Cleaners do not leave loaded shotguns tucked under the furniture. Hosts do not leave weapons out for guests. I slowly, carefully pressed the action release button near the trigger guard and pulled the pump back a half-inch. The smooth brass rim of a red shotgun shell gleamed in the chamber. It was fully loaded. A cold, paralyzing terror washed over me. Why is there a loaded gun under the couch? The question echoed in my mind, deafening and urgent. You only hide a loaded weapon within arm's reach of the sofa if you are expecting someone to come through the front door. Or you hide it there if you are waiting for someone to sit on the sofa. The coffee, the wet towel, the foggy mirror. They weren't the cleaners. The cleaners never made it up the mountain. My eyes darted frantically around the living room. The front door was locked. The deadbolt was thrown. But the cabin had a back door. It had windows. It had 2 dark bedrooms I hadn't even looked inside yet. I needed my phone. I needed to call 911, even if the signal was weak. I dropped the shotgun onto the sofa cushions, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control my fingers, and sprinted into the kitchen. I grabbed my phone from the counter, snatched the charging cable from my duffel bag, and jammed it into the wall outlet. I plugged the phone in. The screen remained dead black for 5 agonizing seconds before the white battery icon finally appeared on the glass. 1%. I stood at the kitchen island, staring at the screen, begging it to boot up. The rain was deafening now, a chaotic roar that masked any other sound in the house. If a floorboard creaked, I wouldn't hear it. If a door hinge groaned, I wouldn't hear it. The storm was the perfect acoustic cover. Finally, the Apple logo appeared. The phone booted to the lock screen. As soon as it connected to the faint single bar of cellular signal passing over the ridge, the phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. It wasn't just one message, it was a backlog. The storm had blocked the signal for hours, and now the tower was forcing every missed notification through all at once. Ping, 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 ping. The notifications stacked up on the lock screen so fast I couldn't read them. I swiped up, unlocked the phone, and opened my messages. There were 5 missed texts from Greg, the Airbnb host. I opened the thread. Greg, 5:20 p.m. Hey, my cleaning crew just called. They couldn't get up the mountain because of the mud, but they said there's a truck parked in the driveway. Are you already there? You're 4 hours early. My blood ran completely cold. I didn't get there at 5. I got there at 8:30. I was the only car in the driveway. Greg, 5:45 p.m. Please answer. Who is at the property? Greg, 6:10 p.m. I just checked the digital lock logs. The code wasn't used today. Someone used the physical master key from the lockbox yesterday afternoon and never put it back. You didn't check in yesterday, did you? My throat was completely dry. I couldn't swallow. I stared at the bright screen, the white light burning into my eyes in the dim kitchen. Greg, 6:45 p.m. I'm calling the police. Do not go to the cabin. I'm canceling the reservation. The guy who rented the place last week, his wife just messaged me. She said he's having a severe psychotic break. He took his hunting gear and left his house 3 days ago. She thinks he went back to the cabin. I stopped breathing entirely. My eyes slowly raised from the glowing screen of the phone, looking out across the butcher block counter, across the dark living room, toward the dark open hallway that led to the bedrooms. My phone vibrated one final time in my hand, the last message in the queue. Greg, 7:30 p.m. The police just called me back. The mudslide washed out the access bridge. They can't get cars up there. They said if you get this, turn around. He is highly dangerous and he is armed. Do not unlock that door. I stared at the last sentence. Do not unlock that door. I slowly looked to my right, toward the heavy wooden front door of the cabin. The deadbolt was still thrown. The door was still securely locked. I had locked it the second I walked in. I had locked the two of us inside. The deafening roar of the rain pounding on the roof suddenly seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a sound that was infinitely closer, infinitely quieter, and infinitely more terrifying. It was coming from the dark hallway, just 10 feet away from the kitchen island. It was the wet, rhythmic sound of heavy breathing. A shadow, darker than the blackness of the hallway, slowly detached itself from the wall. You found my gun, a man's voice rasped from the darkness, the words thick and slow. I was wondering when you'd check under the couch. In that fraction of a second, the human brain stops processing logic and devolves into pure reptilian survival instinct. I didn't scream. I didn't ask him what he wanted. I didn't try to reason with a man having a psychotic break. I just ran. I lunged to my right toward the front door, my stocking feet slipping wildly on the polished hardwood. Behind me, I heard the heavy, deliberate thud of his boots stepping out of the hallway. I heard the sickening rustle of the leather sofa cushions as he grabbed the weapon I had left, sitting right out in the open. I slammed my body weight into the solid wood of the front door, my fingers fumbling blindly for the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so violently that my grip kept slipping on the brass turnpiece. The sharp, unmistakable sound of a pump-action shotgun being racked echoed through the small cabin, cutting straight through the white noise of the storm. I finally caught the ridge of the lock. I twisted the deadbolt, ripped the heavy door open, and threw myself out into the blinding rain. I didn't bother with the porch stairs. I vaulted straight over the wooden railing. plunging down into the freezing mud of the driveway. I scrambled on my hands and knees, tearing my fingernails on the sharp gravel until I reached the driver's side door of my Jeep. I ripped it open and threw myself inside, not caring that I was covered in thick brown mud. I slammed my hand onto the push-to-start button. The engine roared to life. As I threw the transmission into reverse and hit the gas, the headlights swept across the front porch. He was standing there. He wasn't running after me. He wasn't aiming the gun at the windshield. He was just standing perfectly still at the edge of the porch in the pouring rain, holding the shotgun down by his side, staring at my car with a blank, hollow expression that was somehow infinitely more terrifying than active rage. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The Jeep fishtailed wildly in the mud, scraping against the rusted mailboxes before I managed to correct the steering. I drove blindly down the pitch-black mountain road, sliding dangerously close to the sheer drop-offs, not caring if I wrecked the suspension. I just knew I couldn't stop moving. 2 miles down the mountain, my headlights hit a wall of flashing red and blue lights. The police barricade at the washed-out bridge. I slammed on the brakes, leapt out of the car into the rain, and started screaming for the officers. It took the tactical team almost 12 hours to secure a route up the mountain and approach the property on foot. When they finally breached the cabin the next morning, they found him sitting exactly where I had been, on the green sofa, staring at the blank television screen, the shotgun resting across his lap. Greg refunded my money, obviously, and Airbnb paid to detail my car. But no amount of money will ever fix the sheer paralyzing terror I feel every time I check into a hotel or rent a house. I still double-check every lock, every closet, and under every bed. Because now I know that locking a deadbolt doesn't always keep the monsters out. Sometimes it just traps you inside with them.